Today we're going to begin our look at the Vietnam War. A few details about the Vietnam War is that it was the longest war in U.S. history at its time. Roughly, troop involvement for the United States, major troop involvement, lasted from 1965 through 1973, so roughly about 8 years. Now, only our most recent war in Afghanistan really has surpassed that. Iraq lasted about 8 years as well, but Afghanistan, we've now been there since 2001, and so it's currently 2014, so we're 13 years and counting into the war in Afghanistan. But at its time, Vietnam was the longest war in U.S. history. Now, the war itself, the whole entire war, lasted from 1959 until 1975. And really, from the perspective of the Vietnamese, they sometimes refer to it as the 10,000-day war, which would roughly be about 30 years. The truth is that Vietnam has a long history or a long struggle in which they fought for independence. And U.S. involvement really kind of began somewhat around 1959. And although major troops were withdrawn by 1973 or in 1973, we still had some involvement all the way through the collapse of South Vietnam in 1975. And it cost the U.S. $200 billion. And nearly 58,000 Americans died as a result of the war. Our learning objectives, as we look at this first section, are to explain the reasons why the United States became involved in Vietnam, and to trace the escalation of U.S. involvement in Vietnam, and next, to compare and contrast the war strategies that were employed. So first we look at the Vietnam vitals. Vietnam is rich in many natural resources. It was first conquered by China, and then France came in the 1500s for spices. Vietnam had always resisted imperialism. Now, Vietnam was, became part, along with Cambodia and Laos, of what became known as French Indochina, kind of during the period of the new imperialism, when European countries were building colonies all around the world in the kind of mid 19th century up into the early 20th century. And so, like I said, had become known as French Indochina. But then during World War II, Vietnam was overrun by the Japanese. France, of course, having been overrun by the Nazis in Europe, France no longer had the ability to defend their colonies. They couldn't even really defend their homeland. So the biggest concern for France, of course, was to drive the Nazis out of France and to recapture or to liberate France from Nazi control. And taking advantage of this opportunity, Japan moved into French Indochina. And the Vietnamese resisted the Japanese, and in fact actually fought alongside American forces during World War II. Ho Chi Minh, who was the leader of North Vietnam during the Vietnam War, actually was a U.S. ally during World War II. And his forces, the Viet Minh, fought alongside American forces. The French, once again, as we mentioned, were preoccupied in Europe during this time frame, and the U.S. had really assisted Vietnam in fighting the Japanese. But with the end of World War II, Vietnam becomes free. And this now brings us to Ho Chi Minh. Ho Chi Minh brought independence to Vietnam. And as we mentioned, he was kind of an ally to the United States. The reality is Ho Chi Minh was a communist, but he was also a nationalist. And he was more of a nationalist than a communist. His greatest goal was to provide independence and self-rule for Vietnam. And he had always actively worked for that. And in fact, he attended the Paris Peace Conference at the end of World War I and had wanted to meet with U.S. President Woodrow Wilson because Wilson was an advocate for self-determination. Wilson, though, was more concerned about issues in Europe and really didn't have time to meet with Ho Chi Minh. Ho Chi Minh left feeling a little bit dejected. he eventually would go on to have involvement with the Soviet Union, where he would be trained at the Comintern, and then would come home and try to spread communism in Vietnam. And so he did prefer communism to capitalism. And this ultimately is the source of the conflict with the United States. His followers, once again, were called the Viet Minh.